familiarity with Maris that Rabbi Shapiro, of course, had. I first actually met him, not in person. I interviewed at Yechiel, I think it was, for the yeshiva. I came to Boston to interview, and through the child, you could see the reflection of the parent and the education that he had given them. And when I spoke to Avi before this evening, he suggested I speak about the role of community, and Talmud Torah is creating community. And I think it's a perfect choice because it really reflects, I think, your father, at least the way I knew him. And as was mentioned, many parents come to Yeshivat HaRetzion to study with their children. Baruch Hashem, traveling is much easier than it was in the past. Many people have the ability to be able to come and learn. However, I think Maris stands up for all those who came. In fact, it became a transformative experience for him. It was a life-changing experience in a sense. This immediately brought to myself a Gemara Chagiga, which I think is crucial to understanding exactly his relationship with Yeshiva and his relationship with the broader community of Torah study. It's Gemara Chagiga Daf Hey Amud Bet. The Gemara says it's a well-known story. I'll begin a little before because it's important for this evening also. Mai dichtibu b'Rabbanan. What's the meaning of the pasuk? V'yichiod lanetzach l'yireh shachat. He'll live forever. He won't actually see Sheol. Ki yireh chachamim yamutu. If he observes chachamim in their death, he'll live forever. See the strange statement. Ma yireh chachamim b'mitatan yichyeh. If you observe the good deeds, the personality, the values of a person who's no longer alive, and you learn and derive lessons from that. When you observe them in action during their lifetime, you learn even more. Then we're going to talk the following story. Rav Idi, Abu Rabbi Yaakov Bar Idi, Rav Idi, the father of Yaakov Bar Idi. It says Rav Idi identifies himself as the father of his children. He is Rav Idi, the father of Rabbi Yaakov Bar Idi. So Rabbi Yaakov Bar Idi identifies himself as Yaakov, the son of Idi. But Idi himself identifies himself as the father of Yaakov, meaning they have each one takes pride in the other, which I think is perfectly appropriate here. Having ragil, he would travel for 3 months. He'd spend 1 day in Bet Midrash. He would travel 3 months to get to Bet Midrash, spend a day learning, and then return presumably another 3 months. So he would be in Bet Midrash for a day out of 3, maybe a day out of 6. So Rabbanan used to call him Bar Rabbi Chad Yoma, not necessarily as a praise in a more derogatory sense. He's a one-day learner. Chalash Dati, he became quite upset. Kari Anafshe, he said to himself, Schok Re'o, people make fun of me. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, okay, I'll skip this. Al Bei Medrash, Rabbi Yochanan, no more, no less, went to Bet Midrash, and he delivered a Sicha. V'darash, oti yom yidroshun, v'dad v'chayich patzun. It's a pasuk from the Haftarah of Yom Kippur. V'chi bayom dorshim oto, u'balayla ein dorshim oto. What does it mean yom? I'm daily. People seek me out daily. What does it mean yom? V'chi balayla dorshim, bayom dorshim u'balayla, ela lomar lecha. Kol oseg b'torah, filu yom echad b'shana. First spends a day a year learning is if he learned the whole year. And of course, it depends on the person. If the person spends a day a year, he's traveling for 3 months to get there, but to put it differently, if all he has is a day a year, and he has a short, circumstances don't permit him to spend the whole year in the Bet Midrash. Circumstances allow him a very short period in the Bet Midrash, but the little time he has, he devotes it to learning. So we recognize this is personality. It permeates his whole personality. His essence is the Bet Midrash. Only circumstances allow him the small time, the effort he puts into it, and how he values the time. Or to put it differently, the Bar Rabbi Chad Yoma, that's his personality. He's an Ish Bet Midrash. He belongs to the Bet Midrash. He just happens to spend most of his time in other places. And this is exactly, I think, what Morris was. He came to Midrash whenever he could. It wasn't too often. There's a time you could call a Chad Yom, a week out of a year, or a week out of 2 years. But you could always see how animated. This was his essence. And that's what became so transformative for him. Because he recognized this was his real spiritual home. And essentially, he belonged to Beit Midrash. Just he happened to be, most of the time, doing other necessary things. But essentially, he really saw this as an Ish Beit Midrash. Halamei Yom Echad B'Shana Ki Lamad Kol HaShana Kula. That really was his essence. And, Baruch Hashem, we had the privilege of reading the Beit Midrash that he was attracted to. I smiled before you talked about axiological dissonance, because it shows also when they published one of the Rav's recent books, the editors insisted on having a glossary because they assumed no one knows axiological means. So they wanted a glossary just for words like that. And obviously, your father's thinking the same categories, the same mindset throughout. Existential loneliness speaks to him as something obvious and self-evident, and not simply you have to spend a month and a half trying to figure out what the meaning is. And now, how do we solve? As you mentioned, how do we solve this existential loneliness? One of the means is by common shared values. And here, what comes to mind, of course, is the Rambam's comment in Perusha Mishnayot on another Mishnah, Masechet Avot, Aseh lecha rav u'kinei lecha chaver. And the Rambam talks about 3 kinds of friendship. Utilitarian friendship, what's in the Hebrew translation is chaver, chaverim shlosha sugim, chaver לתועלת, utilitarian, טובים השניים מן האחד, כי אם ישכבו השניים וחם בהם, ולאחד הכרחם. 2 people together accomplish more than one person does. חבר הנאה וחבר לדבר נעלה. חבר לתועלת, the Rambam describes as a business partnership. חבר תענוג, the second form, what he calls חבר הנאה, he gives an example, כחבר, like marriage, or someone who you consult with to give you all kinds of advice. With the third, and what the Rambam thinks is the most exalted form of friendship, v'chaver l'davar da'ala, shetei kmihat shnehem u'matratam li'inyan echad v'siyat hatov. The Rambam says the deepest form of friendship, the most essential form of friendship, is not when we do things together, enjoy each other's company, even if we enjoy it as husband and wife, even if we enjoy it as people who have shared personalities, even if there's good chemistry. But he's talking about that together we strive for certain values, or in the Rambam's phrase, my father, Zatzal used to like to quote a French poet or critic, I don't remember, who said that what is true love? True love is not looking at each other, we're not looking at your wife through your spectacles. It's the two, the husband and wife together, looking at the world through common spectacles. And this is not what the Rambam has in mind. And to quote from Rashi, the same idea. Rashi talks about Al ken yazov isha davivet imo v'davak beishto v'yul v'asar echad. So Rashi says that basar echad relates to the child. Basar echad is the child who's born. But it seems to me that Rashi doesn't mean that only because now they have common DNA. Husband and wife have different DNA, and the child has the DNA of both of them, they become basar echad. It's not something much more profound. What Rashi means is when you raise a child together, when you instill your values in the child, you have in common the most basic aspiration to educate a child, then the marriage itself becomes much deeper. It's no longer simply husband and wife enjoying each other, it's rather they're jointly invested in raising a child. And this is what the Rambam means by and therefore I really think that even though Morris was a bar, your father was a bar Beirati Chad he was basically a friend of all of us. He became part of our community. He was a full-fledged member of the Haritzon community and to a large degree of the Torah community. Because even though he really spent most of his time in Boston or Newton, and he kept Bet Midrash only Yom Echad B'Shana, but his essence, Kilu Kol Shana Kulai is the Bet Midrash, and this formed a bond of friendship and closeness because, exactly because of the common aspiration to advance Torah, to further Torah's goals, to create a community of learning. This is exactly what we had in mind. Someone once wrote about Chassidut, that it's a community not only because the Chassidim know each other, they show together, but it's a community because, like, you think of a spoke, like a bicycle with spokes. Every Chassid looks at the Rebbe, and therefore they become a community because everyone is looking at the same place. Each one's a spoke, which ends up at the same center. And of course, let's remove the word Rebbe and say Kodesh Baruch Hu. Even when you daven together and you learn together, and you have a common goal, which is that eventually everything comes together to the focal point, which is the Kodesh Baruch Hu. And this is exactly what the Rav meant, and I won't quote it now, but the Rav talks about how you build a community in lonely man of faith. Lonely man of faith has existential loneliness, and how do you build a community? What he calls the prayer community, when everybody prays together, and they pray together to the Kadosh Baruch Hu, so it creates a community of all those who pray together. Not that they talk to each other and compare notes, but rather the fact that everyone stands together and prays together creates a community. And the same, of course, is true of learning. And what can I say? My father was a wonderful person. I met him when he came to the yeshiva, and I remember his smile well. I remember saying, the place he used to sit there in the kuch. But in a sense, the bond, even though I met him once every 2-3 years, but the bond was really because essentially every day we're together, because every day we're part of the same community. And he knew that I was on one shul learning, or hopefully learning, and I knew that he was in Newton and also invested. And so we would meet in the baby Midrash, it's about Echad Yoma, but he would be Kol HaShana Kula, or Sefer Torah, and basically all belong to the same community of Kmiha and Na'ara. And of course, that's what Bishop Cruz said before, it's shined throughout the past year and a half when Mrs. Robinson called and asked that we accept him formally as a Talmid in the yeshiva, because now he's no longer working, so he really belongs to the yeshiva. He's simply a Talmid who's sick. So we didn't hesitate for a moment. In other words, normally we would interview someone, but since we knew him well, he already had earned his interview. We accepted the yeshiva, and in a sense, I honestly believe that he is a Talmid yeshiva. Just to reinforce his point, with this, we had a similar story with a 17-year-old a few years ago. So he was ill with cancer, and we accepted him as a 12th grader. He was able to come to yeshiva for 2 days. He came for 2 days, and he was nifter a year later. And to this day, we consider him a Talmid. In other words, we're in touch with the family. He's a Talmid, and we view him as a Talmid of ours. We just had a very short tenure in the baby Midrash. And your father said, we accepted him as a Talmid. We hope, again, we have a kollel now for retired people. We would have hoped to be able to actually enjoy the kollel, but he remains a Talmid of ours forever, and we are proud and happy that he chose that. And indeed, his example should be a light to all of us.